Good morning, everybody. This morning we are going to combine the just getting an overview of these four views, because we're going to kind of talk about. We spent so far really the entirety of the class talking about Pre-Millennialism, and we'll glance at that again. Ultimately, what I wanted to do this morning was provide you with a, I don't want to say easy reference, but I put this material together this morning, and it's 3 articles that I want you to take and highlight. Put this in your notebook. These basically are 3 articles that ask these questions. Number 1, what does the Bible say about Christ's return? And so it's just a couple of pages, mostly all Bible verses. We're going to glance at this, and so what the Bible says about His return. The second article that's in this little stack is what is the millennium of Revelation chapter 20. And the last article is, are we in the kingdom now, or is the kingdom yet to come? So these are 3 articles that really we could sum up the whole class with these 3 articles. And so very important that we study this, because when you're talking with your friends and when you're talking with your neighbors, family, this is an easy reference guide to the discussion at hand. And that is, number 1, for instance, does the Bible teach that God is going to come back in some secret, quiet coming that is maybe known to some and not known to others? Does the Bible teach that? 100% no. So, but the question is where do you go for that? Well, so this, what does the Bible say? Well, it says, number 1, in Revelation chapter 1, every eye will see Him. That basically disqualifies any theory that Jesus is going to come back secretly. So in essence, you have just, very simply with one fell swoop defeated the idea of some type of rapture, or even what some refer to as a realized eschatology, where they claim that Jesus came back in AD 70. So we'll review all of those things, but unfortunately, if the class were us coming in and just conveying what the Bible teaches, it would take a few classes. But unfortunately, the religious world is so contaminated and full of so many false teachings. What we're doing in this class is trying to equip you for us to be able to address those things and not only say, that doesn't sound right, but that's not right because the Bible plainly teaches this. This class is not to disparage anyone or disparage anyone who has different views. But what I have learned, and what probably you have realized, is that you can't fit anybody into a very neat package. I mean, everyone is, even quote-unquote premillennials have widely varying views of the end times. And so one of the things that I wanted to do in this class was to give you some sense from as to kind of, how do you classify yourself? Is it important that we classify ourselves using modern terms? No, not really, but it's important that you, in your discussions, be familiar with these terms so that you can, identify where you're at in that. So we have talked, we're going to do a quick review of basic, and I'm going to just kind of go to this slide here. These are, in essence, and there's multiple ways to categorize these. There's not one simple way, but how would someone define the premillennial view? So someone define that for us. Okay, so there's a couple of different approaches from the standpoint of premillennial, but what is the basis of it, just for definition purposes? Break the word down and kind of give me we've talked about the last couple classes, so give us an overview of what the basic premillennial will teach. That there will be a millennial reign on earth when Christ is going to have a return prior to that. Yeah, so a literal reign, not a spiritual. So there's going to be this physical, material reign of Christ on earth. So that's the idea of premillennial. And that, of course, the pre means that he's going to come back, of course, in a secret way prior to the tribulation. And so of the premillennials, you have pre-trib, you have mid-trib, and post-trib. We're not going to get into that. But when we refer to trib, what are we talking about? The tribulation. And the tribulation in reference here, does anyone know what book of the Bible and what chapter that comes from? Yeah, well, so it's referenced in Revelation, but it's really discussed more in detail in what we call the Olivet Discourse, which is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But we remember Matthew 24 being the most drawn out of those Olivet Discourses. But Jesus talks about a great tribulation. But he talks about one. The key is referencing to one great tribulation. So we'll talk about what that means and when that occurred. I think most of us would believe that the tribulation's already occurred. And so we'll look at that. So premillennial, again, that concept is the idea that there is a literal 1,000 years, a literal reign of Christ on earth, and that can be broken down into several ways. Amillennial or amillennial. Someone give us kind of the overview of that. We're going to talk about that today. Give us kind of the 30,000 feet overview of that.
We're in the end times. This is the millennial, is just figurative.
Okay.
And when Jesus comes back, that's it.
Okay, so you're right on. And so amillennial means that there is, usually, in most cases, does not refer to a physical, literal 1,000-year reign. You may find some that are amillennial, or some that are post-millennial that believe in that, but most post-millennials believe that the millennium is symbolic as well. But amillennial is best referred to as Christ is now reigning, the kingdom has been established, and that he is, that millennium is going to exist. So this, if I show you a picture, look at the bottom one here. So amillennialist would basically convey that the tribulation occurred. Most or not all of Matthew chapter 24, Luke 16, and other places are referring to the tribulation that existed around the time with the, of course, the destruction of Jerusalem, the beginning of course, some of the persecution of the saints, all those types of things. So we would say it already happened, and that Revelation chapter 20 is referring to the symbolic reign of Christ over his kingdom. And we talked about last class that premillennials, or those that believe the kingdom has not yet come, would convey to you that Christ is now not ruling over his kingdom. We would say that he, either on the cross, some say on the cross, or at his ascension, that when he ascended, he, in fact, let's look at that, Acts chapter 1. Let's just glance at that text real quick. We read this last time, but I think it's super important to remind ourselves. But before we do, Luke, we are so glad to have you back. Would you begin our class with a prayer? Okay. Thank you, Luke. So Acts chapter 1, we have here Jesus on the Mount of Olives again, and he is about ready to be ascended. And when he left, where did he go? Okay, yes, he went to heaven, but where specifically? We talked about this last class. The right hand of God. So he's going to tell them, therefore, when you have come together, they asked him, saying, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom of Israel? What kingdom were the disciples thinking he was going to restore? A physical kingdom. And yet that's not what he's talking about. And he says, it is not for you to know the times or seasons which the Father has put in his own authority, but you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit comes. And then verse 9, it says, when he had spoken these things, they watched, he was taken up and received him out of their sight. And when they looked steadfastly towards heaven, he went up, and behold, two men stood behind him, who also said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up to heaven? This same Jesus, who was taken up from you into heaven, will so come in like manner as you saw him go up to heaven. And so we know that he ascended up into heaven. He's going to ascend, and it's at that point he is going to begin rule over his kingdom. He's at the right hand of God. All power and authority has what? So when you ascend the throne, all power and dominion, all those things, all authority was given to him. And so we would say, as all millennialist, that ultimately Jesus is reigning and ruling over his kingdom now, not sometime in the future. Okay, so what about post-millennialism? Now, again, as I said, you can't really kind of squeeze this into a box because there's variations of views on this. But if you want to just refer to this, you can refer to the little section here on post-millennialism. Someone give me just a quick overview of post-millennialism.
Typically, it's a view that there's going to be a millennium reign that is preceded by a period of time where Christian people are converting to Christianity, and then Christ is going to return at the end of that.
Okay, all right. So it is. So I would say that most post-millennialists do not believe in or would not contend that there's going to be a physical, literal reign of Jesus on earth. In order to claim that Jesus is going to reign on earth, you have to, as we've said before, do really bad hermeneutics and do a lot of jumping jacks and backflips to get over the fact that Jesus repeatedly refuses to be referred to or to take on an earthly reign. And he tells Pilate himself, my kingdom's not of this earth. So those that hold that he's reigning physically in that way, of course, look at the book of Revelation differently. And when you do that, the domino effect occurs, and you have to go back and alter a lot of different things. So here's my question for you. And this is, I'm going to just in advance tell you this is kind of a trick question. But which one of those best describes the biblical view? I mean, obviously not premillennialism. I mean, we talked about that. But of the post-millennial view and the amillennial view, which one's the most biblical? Okay, so amillennialism, we clearly identify, and we would believe much of what that says, if not all of what that says. But again, you'll find some amillennialists that probably have variations of different thoughts, but for the most part, I would agree. But does that eliminate that we hold, or that we would disqualify all of post-millennialism? So the difference is, in essence, is that post-millennials, and who did we say at the beginning of class, who commonly held that view? So the restorationists held that view. And even some of the reformers held that view. And the reason why they held that view is that it's referred to oftentimes as the positive eschatology. Why would you call post-millennial? the positive eschatology. The- right, exactly. Now, premillennialism, and maybe even some amillennialists, would hold to an opposite view of a positive eschatology. In what way?
They claim that everything is driving towards the tribulation.
Yeah, they believe that, yeah, that's exactly right. That basically things aren't going to get better in the end. In other words, the world isn't going to be saturated with the gospel of Christ. The kingdom isn't going to really win over. That ultimately sin and Satan will take hold of this earth. It's very much so probably the way we view things. But here's the question, should we view things in that way? Should we basically be satisfied? Well, the kingdom is here and now. It's not going to win in essence. Ultimately, the world is going to come to this culminating fire, which means everything's going to get worse. Is that a proper kingdom view? In what ways? Describe that, Kyle. Why is that problematic to say that?
Number one, Christ talks about his kingdom being victorious. When he speaks to Peter, he says that my kingdom, the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So we know that his kingdom is going to overcome. We also know that he has already overcome the world.
Yeah, so I hope you heard that. I hope you understand that. Do you think that Christ, reigning in his kingdom now, and he provided his disciples before he left, he told them what he wanted them to do. And what did he tell us and his disciples to do before he went to heaven? We know the Great Commission. What did he say? Go into all the world, right? And teach the gospel, doing what? Yeah, exactly. So does that sound like the commission of a doomed, was Jesus knowingly giving that commission with the hope that ultimately it would not work, not be successful, and that it would result in a big catastrophic failure? Do you think God wants his kingdom to fail? Well, we know the entire book of Revelation ultimately teaches the opposite. If you were to summarize what the purpose of the book of Revelation is for, it's to basically tell those people who have in many cases died for the kingdom that, number one, Jesus shed his blood for the church, but also that he wants it to be successful. So what I would say is that, well, you tell me. So, if you were to kind of, put your dot as to where you're at here in this chart, again, this chart is just a brief summary of the variations of views, what would you say?
Somewhere kind of between.
That's exactly right. So my point is that, it's, again, these are modern terms that have been created to kind of classify views of eschatology. Now, there's another view, and if you look at in fact, let me go back to here, look at number 4. And I'm going to even confuse matters even worse, okay? So what is preterism? And my question to you is, are you a preterist? And that term is defined somewhere in the massive stuff that I've given to you, but how would you define that? Preterism. Have y'all had this at any of your classes yet? Okay.
Preterism, the belief that all, or at the very least most, of the book of Revelation is fulfilled.
So if you were a full preterist, you would believe that basically all of Matthew 24, most certainly all of Revelation has, all of the prophecies in the book of Revelation, including the second coming, have already happened. That would be what you would refer to as a full preterist. Okay? So, in other words, go to Matthew chapter 24, and just I want to prep you. We are going to have 2 classes on Matthew chapter 24, and it won't be enough. I can guarantee you, it will not be enough. But if you go to Matthew chapter 24, just glance there really quick. I'm going to just give you just a capsule of what's going to happen in that class. Now, some of you actually have a little title, a non-inspired little headline over your chapter, and what does it say? Okay, so the question is that aren't those titles are inspired, right? Inspired. So just in case you're listening to this and you're not familiar with how the Bible came about, the Bible was not written with chapters, nor verses, nor with little commentary at the bottom, nor was it written with headlines over the chapter. So when you read those, please just know that that is a man's interpretive summary of what's over this chapter. So the question is, and this is a loaded question, which we'll answer hopefully in those classes, is there some of chapter 24 that is talking about the second coming? Well, I'm just going to answer for you. Most of you would say yes, that there are parts of it that do talk about it. And then if I asked you, well, does Matthew chapter 24 talk about the destruction of Jerusalem? Actually, my headline is more inspired than yours, because mine says, over the headline, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. So, that's a joke, by the way. So does chapter 24 talk about the destruction of Jerusalem? All right, let's just take a passage. Look at verse 15. Remember I said that the only places you'll find the word the Great Tribulation is here in Matthew 24 and also in Revelation. And by the way, the Great Tribulation refers to one, basically, it's not referring to multiple tribulations, because what premillennialists will want to do is they'll go to verse 15 and they'll say, well, okay, Jesus may be talking about a great tribulation connected to the destruction of Jerusalem, which clearly this is. And then they would say, well, there's going to be another one. There's going to be another. So can you have multiple the great tribulations? Well, you never find that term. You never see it plural. It's always described as the great tribulation. But so verse 15, and you look down and you look at the language here, and then verse 29, it says, after this tribulation, and then it gives this very apocalyptic language that talks about the darkening of the sun. By the way, how many other places talk about the darkening of the sun? The sun being darkened, the moon turning to blood, and stars falling. How many other places talk about this, use this language? Well, it's almost all in the Old Testament. Ezekiel uses it, Joel uses it, Amos uses it. This is language that basically is describing something very unique, not necessarily the second coming. So the question is every time do you see the darkening of the sun and the moon not giving light, in every case that you find that in the Old Testament, is it talking about the second coming of Christ? 100% no. So again, one of the proper ways of looking, and this is, again, I'm not getting away from preterism, so one of the things we have to look at when we read chapters like Matthew 24 and Revelation, we have to ask ourselves, what did those listening to him, what did those listening to him, how would they have interpreted that? How would they have understood that passage? That's a question we have to ask ourselves. And in the Olivet Discourse here in Matthew chapter 24, who's he talking to? He's talking to his disciples. They're on the Mount of Olives. His disciples were, every one of them, what? They were Jews. Now what's very interesting is that Luke Was Luke Jewish or Gentile? There's some debate about this. I think for the most part we would contend that he was what? He was a Gentile. At least I believe he was. Kyle, you may differ in that regard, but he's going to present a different view. He's going to present this same event from a slightly different perspective because his audience were primarily non-Jews. And so if you're listening to this, if the apostles were listening to this, did they know the book of Daniel, Ezekiel, especially Daniel? Did they know the book? They knew the book of Daniel backwards and forwards. In fact, Jesus refers to Daniel over and over and over again. And when we get to Matthew chapter 24, and write this down in the margin somewhere because I'm going to make sure, I need to make sure you refer to this passage. And that's Daniel chapter 7. Read Daniel chapter 7 when you read Matthew chapter 24. And for those of you who are in that, how many of you were in that? Carol, I know you were in my, that class on the intra-biblical period, and we talked a lot about the prophecies of Daniel and the 483 years. Remember that, Carol? You can explain all of that, right? We'll kind of dig into that a little bit. But preterism, so a full preterist would say that the entirety of chapter 24 here, including Revelation, and that would include the second coming, has already happened.
The full preterists that view the Catholic Church being part of this, the Revelation, part of the focus.
I don't think so. So I think that most full preterists would be the realized eschatology group. And honestly, many members of the church hold what would probably be better defined as a futurist view of like the papacy being among those referred to, Burton Kaufman held that view. Burton Kaufman had various views, and maybe even Wayne Jackson, among other prominent members of the church, would hold in some cases in the book of Revelation referring to the papacy. Specifically regarding the Antichrist. For those of you who, how many of you ever heard of the Antichrist being possibly linked to the papacy that would develop in the later centuries, 3rd, 4th century into the Middle Ages? You've heard that, right? That would be put into a little bit more of a futurist camp. Again, oftentimes those that refer to the papacy are, they criticize those referring to Saddam Hussein and Adolf Hitler being the Antichrist, when in fact it's kind of the same thing, But so a full preterist would fit into the camp of those like, and again, I hate to say it, there are members of the Church of Christ who hold the view that Jesus, in fact, did come back in a secret return in AD 70. And we refer to that group as those who hold to a realized, in other words, all of history has been realized or seen or have come about in history. And of course, that group we refer to as a realized eschatology. So here's the question. Without getting into the nuts and bolts of Matthew chapter 24, do we believe that some, or at least some part of prophecy that's conveyed in Matthew 24 and in Revelation has already been fulfilled? In other words, that those prophecies, specifically regarding the Great Tribulation, and many of the events that he talks about early on with respect to the fact the city was going to be surrounded by the armies of men, and that not one stone was going to be left on top of one another. So would we hold that some, or at least some part, of the prophecies in Matthew 24 and Revelation have already happened? Okay. We would say yes. But we would most certainly hold, as the Bible teaches clearly, I believe, that Jesus has not yet come back because not all eyes have seen him, not all knees have bowed. when he comes back, is going to be a loud event that no one can miss. So we would say that, I guess the question again, using this terminology, where would you fit, how would you refer to yourself in terms of preterism? So we would maybe refer to ourselves as partial preterists. So thus far, you're going to leave class calling yourself a partial preterist, post-millennial, amillennialist. Okay, so when you talk to your friends and neighbors, be sure and use all those terms, so they'll thoroughly be confused about where you stand. But it just points to the fact that these are artificial. It's artificial nomenclature to help us to kind of link and connect these. But obviously, it's hard to do that. Now, what I want to do, although I'm very tempted to keep going through Matthew chapter 24, I want you to refer to the packet of information that was given today. If you did not get it, they're right up here. Nathan, I think there's several that need it in the back. Yes, that's it. Yes, and I apologize. Hole punching failed this morning. Okay. What I want to do is this first article, I want you to maybe with your pen just highlight a couple of these verses that I think are very important for us to review. In 2 Peter chapter 3, the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night. And again, as we state here, there's lots of different views, but one of the things that I think is, and it's going to be important when we look at the book of Matthew chapter 24. And by the way, before you completely get out of this, I want you to circle one verse. And I'm just prepping you for this in this regard. So first of all, Matthew chapter 24 says a lot of what we're going to read in a second with regards to, look at verse 36, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angel of heaven, but my Father only. And then he's going to refer, of course, to the days of Noah. But one of the things that I think is very important is that Jesus, especially in his other discourses in this regard, is going to make a very important comment in respect to the fact that when these events will occur. And most specifically, look at verse 34 of chapter 24. Someone read verse 34. What things take place? Okay, that's exactly the right answer. That was not. I didn't mean to trip you up there. But so here's the hard part, and again, I'm making note of this because this is a really challenging passage here, and it's going to at least have some bearing when we look at these other verses. So verse 34. Right before that, look at verse 30. Then the sign of the Son of Man. The sign of the Son of Man. The language there being a lot different than some of the language we're going to look at in just a minute with regards to the fact of the actual coming of the Son of Man or the return of the Son of Man. But you see what it says here, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven when all the tribes of earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. And then look at verse 34. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. So, now some people, a preterist or even a full preterist would go to this passage and say, well, all of this has been fulfilled. including what they would interpret as the second coming. That's at least some people believe is referred to in chapter 30, in verse 30. Look at verse 30. The sign of the Son of Man will appear, Son of Man coming down in clouds. Now, when you read that, that's where you want to put Daniel chapter 7, because basically Jesus is quoting almost verbatim from Daniel chapter 7. Yes, sir.
I'm sure when we get to the Matthew 24 class, we'll talk about it more. But he makes the same exact statement in Matthew 26 to Caiaphas, saying, "You, Caiaphas, will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds."
Yeah, so that's a great passage that we'll definitely refer to. But what does that make you think about? It makes you think about the possibility that verse 30 is not talking about the second advent. It would be challenging, although I'm not going to say impossible. I'm not going to say if you believe that this is referring to Jesus' second coming, that you're off or that we need to disfellowship you. That's not the case at all. But there is very good information to suggest that when Jesus says, "Assuredly, when I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away before these things place," that he was saying what he meant. And if you want to go to that Greek word for generation and somehow extend that beyond 20, 40 years, you ain't going to be able to do that grammatically appropriately. But anyway, now, so with that in mind, now let's look at this article that says, what does the Bible say about Christ's return? And the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night. In other words, will there be signs? Will there be signs of him coming? And boy, how many books have been sold online or in bookstores that talk about signs of the second coming? How many? Thousands. And yet, what does Peter say here? And where does it say elsewhere? That no one knows. That no one knows. All right. And that's going to come when you least expect it. Let's turn your Bibles to 1 Corinthians 15, verses 22 through 28. 1 Corinthians 15. Again, this is... who is this audience, by the way, speaking here, that he's speaking to? Absolutely. Absolutely. Predominantly Gentiles in a predominantly very worldly, physical place. And there was lots of false teaching going on. You probably had those that were doubting the second coming, because ultimately we know that a lot of what Jesus said was not understood plainly. And some people were expecting the second coming right away. They were expecting it within their lifetimes. And again, there was a lot of confusion that was going on. And so in verse 22, someone read that through 28, and actually stop at the end of verse 24.
Whereas in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive. But each in his own order. Christ the first fruits, and after those who are Christ's at his coming. Then comes the end, when he hands over the kingdom to God and Father, when he has abolished all rule and all authority and all power.
Okay, let's stop there. What can we learn from this passage? I mean, this is not apocalyptic language here, so we're not in the book of Revelation, so we're not using symbols. This is Jesus. This is basically Paul speaking in very plain language. So what can we learn from this? First of all, how is Christ the first fruit? He was raised from the dead first. And then when he comes, those who belong to him. And who are they? 100%. So when that happens, and we go immediately in verse 24, when we see the word then. Now the question is, grammatically in the Greek, does the word then allow us to have a vast period of time in between these two verses. Look at it. So we have, when he comes, those who belong to him, then the end will come. So a premillennialist are those that would hold that there's going to be multiple returns of Jesus. The premillennial view is that he will return, of course, to rapture the saints, and then he's going to take them up over the course of 7 years. They're going to be basically shelved in heaven, and then those poor people are going to be brought down to earth after the tribulation for a literal 1,000-year reign. So does this verse allow for that? Does it allow it at all? So in verse 24, we have the end will come. So the question is what end is he referring to? Well, we know it's the end of time, the end of history, because it's that point in which he's going to hand the kingdom of God over to the Father, and he will destroy all dominion, all authority, and power. Verse 25. Someone read 25 through the rest of that section through 28.
He must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. For he has put everything under his feet. Now when it says that everything has been put under him, it is clear that this does not include God himself, who put everything under Christ. When he has done this, then the Son himself will be made subject to him who put everything under him. God may be smaller.
Okay, so when he comes back, he is so Christ is ruling over what right now? He's ruling over his kingdom. The kingdom has been established. Okay? Jesus said that some of you in this generation will not die before you see the kingdom. And there's we'll talk more about the details of why we can know for sure that Jesus is ruling in his kingdom. And verse 25 says that he must reign. He is reigning over his kingdom. But when he comes back, he is going to, and again, this is Old Testament prophecy, that when he comes back, he is going to literally, I guess in a figurative way, in a spiritual way, hand the kingdom back over to the Father. He's going to give the kingdom, which who consists of the kingdom? Who is the kingdom? Who is the kingdom? That's terrible grammar. But who is in the kingdom? Yes, the called out, those that have been redeemed, those who've come in contact with the blood of Christ, all of those folks. So it's the church, it's the called out. They are going to be given to God the Father. But until that time, verse 25 says he must do what? He must reign. He must reign. Okay. Any questions about that? Matthew, all right. So, I want to just look really quickly to Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. We have lots of passages, specifically Revelations 22, chapter 3, I am coming soon, I am coming soon. And then Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. Now, Revelation is a book that in part is written in apocalyptic language. Chapter 1 is written in much more narrative form when it's referring, of course, to the seven churches of Asia. So again, this is hard to read this in some symbolic phrase, but someone read Revelations chapter 1, verse 7.
Behold, he is coming with the clouds, every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all sides of the earth will wail on account of him. Even so, amen.
Okay. So one of the things that I think we can be assured of is that when he comes back, every eye will see him. Every eye will see him. And then lastly, before class is over, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 28. Hebrews 9, 28.
Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sin of many, and he will appear a second time, not for sin, but in salvation for those who live.
Okay. So, folks, that passage clearly eliminates multiple returns of Jesus. And so we can read very plainly and clearly what the Bible says about his return. And folks, I assure you that there's more to come in that respect. There's lots of other places we could go to investigate this further. I'm going to read one more in John chapter 5, verses 28 through 29. John 5, do not be amazed for this, for the time is coming when all those who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out. That's consistent with what we just read in 1 Corinthians 15. And those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned. What this teaches is what? So a judgment's going to basically take place, and both good and bad will be judged at the same time. Now, that seems kind of commonsensical, but premillennialism teaches different. It teaches that there's going to be multiple judgments. Remember, we talked about the judgment of the sheep and goats, and there's going to be a final judgment that's called the white throne judgment at the end of time. Okay, so how do you feel now? You feel like that I know, Luke, this is your first class here. You may feel like a little behind, but that's okay. You'll catch up. But do you feel a little bit better about where we're at as far as kind of how we identify where we're at and what we believe to be true and what the Bible teaches? Everybody at a good state? Okay. All right. So next class, let me turn to our handy dandy outline. This day, we're going to begin to explore, again, kingdom concepts. We have 2 classes on the nature of the kingdom, and we talked a little bit about that. We talked about the fact that Jesus refers to the kingdom. The kingdom is at hand. Multiple times he says, and I have prepped you with this article that's in the stack of stuff that I just left here, and it's the last article, Are We in the Kingdom Now? Okay, so read this in preparation for class and come to class ready to go and talk about the kingdom. We have 2 classes on that. So thank you. You'll have a